Hello, I am Madeline James, and today we are going to be talking about chapter breaks. And I apologize, I'm still dealing with this sinus infection, something, I don't know, so my throat sounds real weird right now. I apologize. But I've got to the point in my current draft where I am doing my major first revision, so I'm going from my first draft, which is all broken up by scenes, and I'm actually changing it to be broken up by chapters, which is a new thing for me because the last book that I majorly revised, it had multiple POVs. And I just switched chapters when the POV changed, and that's how I managed it. And so I didn't really have to think about chapter breaks for other reasons. And so I've been doing a lot of research on this, and I thought since it's a commonly confused thing, someone in my Discord had the idea of doing a video on this, which, thank you. So we're going to talk about chapter breaks. So let me pull up. I took some notes. I hope you can read them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what is a chapter break, right? And this may seem really, really obvious, but what happens at the end of a chapter, right? Obviously it's where one chapter ends and then another begins, but what actually happens here? So the things I've been thinking about are that it is a pause, right? So it's a moment where the reader has that pause to maybe reflect or wonder or think. It's also a transition, so it gives you some more space or separation from the narrative before you're diving back in with the next chapter. It's also a spot for a break, so a good place to come back later. And, that narrative focus at the end of a chapter I think is pretty significant, and we'll talk about that a lot more, but essentially we can end on something significant, and wherever that chapter is going to have a lot more narrative weight or narrative focus to it. So one of the most common ways to end a chapter is with a hook, right? Very high level. But, just like you lure your readers into your book with, your bio, the, end matter of your book, a hook at the end of a chapter will lure readers into reading the next chapter, right? That sort of ties into one of the things that creates a page turner, right? You're always wanting to go to the next chapter in addition to quick pacing that keeps you moving through those chapters quickly. So even if readers take a break at that chapter break, we want them to be thinking about and caring about what happens next. If they get to that end of the chapter and they're like, well, I have no thoughts at all on what happens next, there's nothing I'm desiring to see, I'm, not motivated to read anything else, are they even going to come back to the book? And if they are they going to come back with a lot of interest? So, that's obviously important, but a hook can be a lot of things, right? That's a very broad category, especially in this type of thing. So, I have roughly, at a super high level, some places where a chapter break could be. And this is, we'll get more into the actual locations within a scene, but this is just at a high level. So obviously, based off what we've already talked about, there are functional places to place a chapter break. So a time jump, a location jump, a big transition after an act or a plot point, something like that. It could be where you have a cliffhanger, right? So a question to answer, an answer that happened that you're looking for the consequences for now, or some sort of big realization. And it could be emotional, so a really big reveal, or some place where it's good to pause and have readers reflect on that big emotional reveal. These are all good places within a story to have a chapter break. You don't have to look at this too closely. This is one of the notes from my cheat sheets on scenes that I was doing when I was diving through structure. But for me, it's helpful to think about where to end chapters within a scene structure. This may be a little bit more of an analytical way to look at it, but I always find that going super analytical, getting really deep into the theory of it, helps me apply it in a less structured way as well. So, and with this, I went way deeper before than we need to here. We're going to simplify this, but let's talk scene structure real quick. So I wanted to pull these in. These are different drawings I did. They're inspired by, I think it was in a story by Robert McKee, some of the scene potential progressions. Just to kind of give an idea that there's a lot of different elements that can be in a scene, a lot of different types of scenes. You don't need to be super familiar with, the different ones that are here, but I just wanted to show this just to kind of get that idea in your heads. But from those, we have essentially 4 components, right? So we have the stimuli, whatever is triggering the start of the scene. This could be something that is internal, so the character or the protagonist has a goal, or it could be something external, or I think they call it antagonistic, right? Where something's forcing your character to act, something external to them. And then you obviously have the conflict where they're trying to, accomplish their goal, but there's difficulty. And then you have a stakes flip. And this isn't always in there, and sometimes it's just stays on the same side, but they go from winning to losing, or losing to winning, or losing to really losing, right? And then you have the scene turn, where something happens at the end of the scene that will help turn it to the next one, right? So we can put this on a story graph that everyone will be familiar with to make this a lot easier to think about. So this is kind of what I put together. And there's a million ways you could do this, right? There's a million ways you can label scenes in general, but this is the one that kind of works for my brain. But again, we have that starting stimuli, which can be an internal goal or something external or antagonistic to react to. And then we have the conflict. And this conflict section can include a stakes flip, right? Where maybe they go to do something and it starts out really easy and then all of a sudden it gets more difficult, right? Something like that within those ups and downs of that conflict where they're winning, they're losing, they're winning, they're losing. How's it going to turn out, right? So then we have the climax. And the climax of the scene is where two things really happen, right? First, there's typically all that conflict and tension comes to a head, and then there's normally some sort of surprise or twist. So this is like you expect one thing to happen, and maybe it sort of happens that way, but like something new is revealed in it, right? If your climax occurs and the scene turns out exactly the way your character wants it to, or the way the reader thinks about the beginning, then you haven't really done anything, right, to push things forward, right? You're just, this is what's obviously going to happen, right? So it's not always like a big deal, but like normally there's something little or surprising or new information that happens or a realization, right? There's something that the character's expectations are not met, right? And that can have a little twist or a little turn, right? Things have been going well in the story, now they're doing worse. Things have been doing bad in the story, now they have a little win, or, things get more extreme. There's a lot of things that could happen in there. But one of the other things immediately after that is there's the outcome of the scene goal, right? Are they successful with what they're trying to do in the scene, or are they not successful? And then you have the resolution, and I'm sort of considering the resolution to kind of also contain a lot of, like, we'll get into this in the next slide, but like what a sequel is, right? The sort of the falling action of a scene, right? So this could be where they're really thinking on what happened in the scene, they're reflecting, they're deliberating, they're coming up with what's going to happen next, right? They're reacting to it. All that internal side to the action of a scene. And so this also contains whatever their new goal is. It might have the consequence, or they might be looking toward the consequence. And also, again, we have our success and failure after the climax. So this is just another thing for my notes on a way to look at scene structure. I know this one I think is a lot more common of a way to look at it, so this will tie into what we're doing too. And there are so many different options and ways to break down scenes, just like there are so many ways to break down story structure in general. Like it's all good. Whatever makes the most sense for your brain and the way you write is the right way, right? But so this one basically is where you have scenes, which is you have a goal, you have your conflict, and you have your disaster, which is essentially our stimuli, conflict, and climax in our previous one. And then here they have your reaction, right, which is typically like your emotional reaction to whatever the disaster is or climax, the dilemma or thoughts that follow it, reviewing, analyzing, planning, and then whatever the decision is, right, your new goal that leads you into the next scene, right? And then there's also like little transition bits. And this all fits into what we're doing. The sequel is sort of part of that resolution falling action in the little thing I drew out, right? So that's kind of what we're working with. All right, so let's talk about where we could put a break, right? I have, again, outlined and drafted all of my scenes in this sort of a structure, right? Where I start with whatever the goal or stimuli is, the conflict, there's a climax, and then what leads to the next thing, right? And that's how I've written all of my scenes. That's how I've outlined my book. And even if you didn't intentionally do that, you still have these pieces. And even if you're basically pantsing, you're going to be having these pieces where like, okay, I'm going to start this scene. And then at some point you're going to wrap it up and start the next one, right? And so I think that this is all going to make sense no matter what approach you're going with. But it really helps me to think about this in the frame of like, as I'm going through it, like what my options are, what might be best, right? So first option is to end with a new goal, right? So this is where, at the end of maybe the resolution, where the character has a new goal, right? And whatever that outcome of the scene was has led to that. And so we could end the chapter with that statement of that new goal. And so the hook of that is, right, okay, but how are they going to do it, right? It's not their full plan. It's just they're going to do this, right? And there's a gap in the reader's understanding between where they are now and where they need to be to accomplish that goal, right? And this can be small because we're probably talking about the next scene goal, right? So it's a small gap. It's a small, well, how will that happen? What will the problems be, right? Like, it makes us wonder, right? How will they succeed? How are they going to do it? Especially if there's already conflict that we anticipate. So there could be built-in stakes there where we're like, oh my gosh, but if you try to do this, what about this, right? Something to get us thinking and worrying and imagining what's going to happen next, right? And so the end of a scene can be a really good place for that because that's typically where a character will make a new goal. But that can also happen right after an external or antagonistic stimuli. Because if you remember, sometimes a scene starts with a character's new goal, but sometimes it starts by something external forcing them to act. And so right after this place can also be a good place to have a chapter end, is right where this external stimuli has happened and the character is like, oh no, I have to do this, right? So this can be similar hook, right? How will they accomplish this? Can they accomplish this, right? So an example is like, oh, we've been having a random court scene or whatever, and then all of a sudden they find out the invaders are storming the castle, right? That's our external stimuli. And the character is like, okay, I have to escape. End chapter. And now the reader's like, has that anticipation of, oh no, how are they going to solve this problem, right? Because you're smacking them right into the beginning of this tension building, right? And so they want to know, how can they escape? Will they escape? What's going to throw a wrench in it? Because it can't be that easy, right? Because it's a book, and that's how books work, right? That's how story works. Another example could be, maybe you're writing like a thriller or something like an action mystery, and all of a sudden the main character hears a noise they shouldn't hear, and they've decided they're going to find out what it is, right? End chapter. And you're thinking there, like, there's that mystery side of it of like, oh, what did they hear? What's going to happen when they go to find it, right? Like, you tell them what's going to happen, but there's so many questions left that will hook them into the next chapter, right? So that's ending with a new goal. So then sort of similar, but a little bit more, a little lighter, right, is instead of a new goal, we can end with a new approach. And this is typically in the stakes flip portion of the scene conflict or right before that, where essentially they've been approaching a goal. The conflict is getting too great that whatever their current approach is, right, their strategy is not going to work. And they have to find a new approach or a new angle to kind of change the game to be able to come out hopefully successful at the end. And so this could be like maybe, the invaders stormed the castle. That was our external stimuli. They decided they need to escape. That is, that new goal after that external stimuli. But then the character finds out, oh, they're closed in and they have no route to escape, right? They can't just keep running out like they had planned on doing. So they have to decide to cause a huge distraction. And this can be a good place, very similar to a new goal to end a chapter, where, maybe they pull out a stick of dynamite, end chapter, right? That's their new approach, but you don't get to see if it's going to work out or not, right? The hook is similar. All right, so another option is to end with a realization. And this kind of ties into both, it can be stakes, it can be an emotional side of it too. But normally, one common place for this is before a new goal, right? So the realization that leads to it. And in a scene, right, we'll frequently see this happen in either the climax, where something surprising happens, right? And that subverts our expectations. This is where we learn something new or something doesn't go the way we expect. And it can be typically, but not always, a more external realization. So a realization about something that happened outside of them, right? And the hook here is going to be disbelief, right? Any sort of surprise is going to cause that, wait, is that really what happened? Obviously surprise, what does this mean? And how does this change things? Those are all questions you think about at this point. So that can be a good place to end a chapter with those thoughts. So this could, for example, be like, okay, we're hunting our nemesis and we're pretty sure it's person A and we've been hunting them all night, right? That's what our conflict is. We knew they were going to be so-and-so. We're racing them through the streets, whatever. We finally corner them in an alley, right? And we catch them, right? But we discover that it's not this person we've been fighting with all along, it's actually our lover that's been doing these things, right? End chapter, right? Because that's a wild realization that changes things, but how does it change things? What does it mean? How did the lover do this, right? There's so many questions and thoughts and emotions right there that's a great place to end a chapter. Another common place for realization, which can tend to be a little bit more internal, will be after the like sort of resolution sequel part of a scene where they're reflecting, thinking, deliberating over whatever that surprise was, right? At the climax, over whatever happened there. Maybe they failed, maybe they learned something new, who knows, right? But something unexpected happens and now they have to process. And through that processing, they can realize something. Maybe it could be external, like putting a clue together, like they realize the connection between A and B due to the climax, and now they have some new theory or suspect. Or it could be they realize something about themselves, right? So the hook here can be, commonly emotional. It can be very like, now what, right? Because if this is something internal, typically this is what's going to lead to a new goal. So maybe the character has this big realization about how they've been acting or who they are inside. And now, in addition to heartstrings being pulled, the reader's wondering, okay, but now how is this going to change your plan? What are you going to do about this, right? So an example is maybe we've finally escaped a forced marriage that we've been fighting through the whole book, right? Only to realize after, the character actually saves our best friend when we thought they were awful, right? And then we realize after that we actually love them, right? We've just escaped the forced marriage, but now we realize we're in love with them, and maybe we regret it, right? End chapter. All right, so similar to this, right, we can end with a question. And this can be where reflection has led to, instead of a realization, a question, a new thing we're wondering. Like maybe we've solved one problem, but, as story goes, one answer typically leads to a new question, right? So the hook here is obvious, right? We want the answer too. There's that suspense of like, oh, what is the answer to this question? So an example for this could be maybe our main suspect is cleared, but now we're wondering like, who actually did it, right? End chapter. Or that moment where they discover something after like a murder mystery in a house or whatever, and they realize one of us is the killer. End chapter, right? Who is the killer? Maybe it could be the main character has received 3 marriage proposals throughout the scene, and they have to choose one. Who are they going to choose? End chapter, right? And, again, the hook here is obvious, the suspense, the wonder, what's it going to be, right? And I find that, as a side note, whenever I end up ending the chapter, because again, I'm doing this after the fact, right? I'm not thinking about where the chapters are going to break when I'm writing my scenes, but I tend to rework it a little bit to really help wherever I've decided to end it really hit harder, right? So making that question, in this case, a little bit more like, that would be like one line by itself at the end of the chapter, right? This question, right? And then we dive into the next one. Okay, so we can end with a cliffhanger, and this is always very obvious, right? A lot of writers will really lean into this, and, it kind of depends on what you're going for, but I like to vary things up. But this is essentially where, the dice have been thrown, the arrow has been let loose, and we're waiting for the results, right? Is it a success or a failure, right? The action has already occurred, now we need the response. And it's sort of like Schrodinger's cat, right? Where until we read on the next chapter, it could have been a success or it could have been a failure. But it's already been started, right? Fate is already there, we just don't know what it is. And so this is most commonly right at that pinnacle of the climax before we know what the scene's action is, ultimately successful or a failure. And so the hook is obvious. What happens? Did they succeed? Did they fail? So this could be the main character shoots their very last arrow. They've been trying to take an enemy down, and if this arrow doesn't stop them, they're going to be overcome, right? And end chapter. Or this could be the main character finally has revealed that that they love this other character, right? They've had their whole monologue through their argument, and they reveal their love. End chapter, we don't know how they respond, right? Do they love them back? Are they going to be like, oh my gosh, I hate you, right? We don't know. So then another place we can have a cliffhanger could be at the end of a scene, where we sort of think the scene has ended one way, but did it really, right? And this is sort of like the mystery side of it, right? And this is usually a false failure. It can be done with a false victory, but normally it's a false failure because it ramps up the stakes really high and we're like, oh my god, no, did that really just happen? So an example of this could be maybe the main character is battling on the top of a mountain or something, and then they were thrown off a cliff, right? Seemingly, they just lost. They're dead now. End chapter, right? Or maybe the main character is drinking tea and looks down and realizes they've been poisoned, and then they collapse, right? End chapter. Are they dead? Are they alive? What happened, right? The hook here is, again, really obvious. What just happened? And there's also that pull of the denial, you know? Like, a lot of readers assume there's a lot of, like, plot armor and stuff. And, like, obviously in some books, there's not that much plot armor, but typically they'll be, you know, doubting what happened. And if you were to have this as, like, a false victory, it could be something where, like, you would have to play it up and make it obvious that, like, this is too good to be true. Did that really just happen? Did we really just succeed for everything? Like, what are we missing? You know, there can be that side of it as well. So then another option is to end with higher stakes, right? So a place where the stakes have gone up, and then we end the chapter there. And we already covered a lot of places that could include these higher stakes. These are the ones I have marked here. So that external stimulus at the start that the main character must react to, that can heighten the stakes, right? The subversion or surprise in the climax, that can heighten the stakes, right? Or it can happen at the end along with the realization if that realization heightens the stakes. Like, oh no, it's not just someone in the house that done it, right? It's some greater position of authority, right? They just don't know which one or how to get them, something like that, you know? And the hook here is obvious, right? It's increased danger, increased consequences. How is the main character going to rise to the challenge? Can they rise to the challenge, right? So another spot that you can have this can be during the conflict section. So basically, stakes can get higher in that conflict, right? Because you should have increased difficulty, increased stakes throughout this scene as we build towards the climax. So this could be a spot where the main character realizes it won't be as easy as expected, right? Maybe they're going to a ball and they have to steal a gem from someone, but then they go there to dance with them to start, like, trying to steal this gem from them, and they realize that the person knows they're trying to steal it, right? That is an unexpected challenge. Another example of this could be maybe the main character here is that there's a dragon coming and they're like, okay, I can take down one dragon, and they rush out to battle it, only to realize there's two, or it's a much bigger dragon than they expected, right? End chapter, right? Obviously, there's a lot of options here of where we can end it, right? And depending on what kind of scene it is, you're going to have different options here. Not all of these are going to be present in every single scene, but you can end it almost anywhere, right? And I'm pretty sure there are going to be plenty of options that I missed here, and if they are, let me know. But this leads to our next question, right? Why are you going to choose one spot to end the chapter over another, right? And I've sort of been thinking about this a lot, and I've come up with a hierarchy of decisions. Because there are so many functions and options for ending a chapter, for where to put a chapter break. So we have to choose one of these over another. So the first thing I am considering is narrative emphasis or narrative weight. Again, the end of a chapter is going to have more emphasis and narrative weight than any other place within a scene. So it's a really good place for significant beats and significant moments in the overall book. These places should probably happen at the end of a chapter. And so I have some examples here, right? So like any major twist in the book. Maybe in a mystery you have a lot of these, right? Or in like a thriller. But this could be, if you're following like the Save the Cat beat sheet, this could be the Hightower surprise in your major climax sequence or your midpoint twist, right? It could end on those moments because those are great places to keep moving forward. And also, not even just to keep the reader reading, but again, to give emphasis to these points in the story because they're big turns and changes. Another place is major goal changes, right? So the refusal of the call, the acceptance of the call, and then any point within the story where they've kind of realized they need to have some new major goal to solve the problem. This is a good place to end a chapter, right? To make it really clear to the reader that we're kind of entering a new era of, you know, our character's agency. And then another big thing is major emotional moments. So maybe once they hit rock bottom, we end a chapter there. Maybe once they have their aha moment, that realization, we end a chapter there. Like those moments that are going to give our readers like goosebumps, where they're going to feel, where they're going to be like, oh my gosh, right? Those are great places to give emphasis to. And then another one is going to be major stakes increases, so like major pinch points within your scene. And you could go with this for like major realizations to like your major plot points. All of these super major places that you'd be thinking about at a high level of your scene arcs, those can be great places to end a chapter. And once you sort of know what these are going to be, right, you can either anticipate them coming forward or kind of know how far apart they've been, or like consider it when you're looking at the overall structure. But you can choose your other chapter breaks in service of hitting those, right? Like if you know you have this huge thing coming in the next scene that's going to be like 1,000 words, maybe you don't end your chapter there and have 1,000-word chapter. Maybe you go past one potential break to let it break somewhere more important, you know? So another reason is more structural. So say you're aiming for roughly 5,000-word chapters or whatever is your convention or your genre convention. You want to maintain somewhat consistent pacing. So once you're around that word count, you start looking for a good place to end the chapter. And alternatively to speed up pacing, you could try to have like some shorter chapters, right? And this is the way this will normally work for me, and I've been doing this a lot, is I will write, and sometimes I come across a moment that's like one of those big points of emphasis, and I'm like, ooh, I need to highlight this, right? And I'll either tweak where I had my last break, or I'll break there, so that I can have that work. But if, you know, I'll just keep writing until I get to roughly the word count where I want to end it. And I'll either be like, okay, well, I'm 500 words from the end of this, which will be a good spot, and I'll do that. Or I'll go back and find the most recent spot that I think would be, you know, the best. And then I'll break it there and then go to the next chapter. So I'll typically write ahead and then cut the last little bit, move it to the next chapter, then keep writing with the next scene. That's been pretty common for how I've been doing it. So then another reason, transitions can be hard for a reader, right? Having these at the end of a chapter can really help the reader with that transition. So this could be like, you could end a chapter right before a time jump. You could end a chapter right before a big flashback. You could end it right before a big POV change. You could end it before a major location change. And these can be things that can help the reader kind of disconnect and reframe themselves where you need them to be, so they don't keep reading, kind of miss that transition's happening, get kind of confused and pulled out of it, right? Because we don't want that to happen. So, to recap, right, what we've been working on, the scene break is going to give us a moment to pause, to transition, or to add emphasis in a story. And there's a lot of places that you can have them within the structure of a scene. It could be after a new goal or approach is stated, after a big realization, on a cliffhanger, where we have heightened the stakes, or it could end on a question. And why would you choose one of these places over another? Well, it could be for narrative emphasis of major story beats, it could be to maintain chapter lengths, and it could be to help readers with transitions. And I am sure there is so much more involved, but this sort of summarizes kind of my notes of what I've been looking at to apply this in this book that I've been going through. And, you know, we're always learning, we're always growing. If you have some thoughts, throw them down below to think about. But otherwise, that's sort of what I wanted to talk about today. Cross your fingers that I'm going to get over the sinus infection quickly, and I will see you in the next one.